I was 71 years old the day I finally understood why she left me. 50 years. It took me 50 years to understand a woman I only loved for 11 months. My name is Walter Robert Hastings, and before I tell you how I found love again, when I had already buried it, I need to tell you about a girl named Dorothy Callahan, and a summer in Chicago that I have never once stopped thinking about. My name is Walter Robert Hastings. I am 72 years old now, and I am sitting on the back porch of a small house in Evanston, Illinois, with a cup of coffee that has gone cold because I have been sitting here remembering instead of drinking. My hands are not as steady as they used to be. There is a stiffness in my knees when I stand up in the morning that reminds me every single day that I am not the young man I once was. But my mind still walks down Rush Street like it was yesterday. My mind still smells like rain on hot pavement and cigarette smoke and Dorothy's perfume, which I could not tell you the name of if you paid me, but which I would know in a heartbeat if I ever smelled it again. I want to tell you a story tonight. It is not a story I have told very many people. My children have heard pieces of it. My late wife knew most of it because she was a kind and understanding woman who never once made me feel guilty for the parts of my heart that belonged to someone else before they belonged to her. But I have never told this story the whole way through, start to finish, to anybody. I think I am telling it now because I am old enough to know that stories like this one do not belong only to the person who lived them. They belong to anyone who has ever loved somebody and lost them and wondered for the rest of their life what might have been. So let me take you back. Let me take you back to Chicago in the summer of 1973. I was 21 years old that summer. I had grown up on the South Side in a neighborhood called Bridgeport in a 2-story brick house with my mother, my father, and my 2 younger sisters. My father worked at the stockyards until they closed, and then he drove a delivery truck for a bakery downtown. My mother cleaned houses for wealthier families in Hyde Park 3 days a week. We were not poor, not exactly, but we were the kind of family that counted every dollar before it was spent. I was the first person in my family to attend college, and I was doing it the hard way, working nights at a print shop on Wabash Avenue and taking classes at the University of Illinois Chicago campus during the day. I wanted to be an architect. I used to carry a sketchbook everywhere I went, drawing buildings I saw downtown, imagining how I would have designed them differently. Chicago in 1973 was a city that felt like it was always moving, always breathing. The L train rattled overhead on its tracks, and you could hear it from blocks away if the wind was right. The Sears Tower was still under construction then, this enormous steel skeleton rising up into the sky, and I remember standing on the street some mornings just staring up at it, imagining what it would look like when it was finished. Nixon was in the news every single night with the Watergate hearings, and my father would sit in his chair after dinner with his eyes fixed on our small television set, shaking his head and muttering about crooks in Washington. The radio played Roberta Flack's Killing Me Softly, and I remember that song specifically because it was playing the very first time I saw Dorothy Callahan. It was a Friday evening in June, and I was working my shift at the print shop, which was owned by a man named Sal Marchetti, a big Italian man with 4 arms like tree trunks and a laugh you could hear 2 blocks away. The print shop was on Wabash, right near the Loop, and we did business cards, wedding invitations, small posters for local businesses. That evening, a young woman walked in about 20 minutes before closing, holding a folder of papers against her chest like she was protecting something precious. She had dark red hair pulled back in a loose braid, and she was wearing a yellow sundress with little white flowers on it, and I remember thinking that she looked like summer itself had walked through the door. "I need 500 flyers by Monday morning," she said, setting the folder down on the counter. "I know that's not a lot of notice, and I know you're about to close, but I already tried 2 other print shops today, and they both told me it couldn't be done." I looked at Sal, who was in the back room already counting the register, and I looked back at this young woman, and something in me just decided I was going to make it happen. "What's it for?" I asked her. "A community meeting," she said. "There's a building on Halsted that the city wants to tear down for a parking lot. It's been a settlement house for 50 years, helped thousands of immigrant families get on their feet. I'm trying to get enough people to show up at the alderman's office on Monday to stop it." I want you to understand something about the way she said that. She did not say it like she was asking for pity or asking for help. because she was overwhelmed. She said it like a general laying out a battle plan. There was fire in her voice and steel underneath the fire. Her name, she told me, was Dorothy Callahan, and she was 22 years old, a year older than me, and she was working 2 jobs of her own, one as a secretary for a law firm downtown and one unpaid, organizing tenants and neighborhood associations on the near west side. I told her I could have the flyers ready by Sunday night if she came back then. She looked at me for a long moment, like she was deciding whether to trust me, and then she smiled. And I felt that smile somewhere behind my ribs in a place I did not know existed until that exact second. "You're a good man," she said. "What's your name?" "Walter," I told her. "Walter Hastings." "Well, Walter Hastings," she said, picking her folder back up. "I hope you're a man of your word. I worked on those flyers that entire weekend. I want to be honest with you. I did not need to spend as many hours on them as I did. I could have laid them out simply and been done in 2 hours. Instead, I spent most of Saturday redesigning the header, choosing the right typeface, making sure the address of the alderman's office was bold enough that nobody could miss it. I told myself I was just doing good work. I think if I am honest with the young man I used to be, I was hoping she would notice the effort. I was hoping it would mean something to her. When she came back Sunday evening, the shop was closed, but I had asked Sal for the key, telling him I had some personal printing to finish. Dorothy walked in and saw the flyers stacked in neat piles on the counter, 500 of them, dry and crisp and perfectly cut, and she picked one up and studied it for a long moment. "You did more than what I asked for," she said. "I wanted it to work," I said, "for your settlement house." She looked up at me then, really looked at me, in a way that made me feel like she was reading something written on the inside of my chest. "Nobody does more than what's asked of them anymore, Walter," she said, "not for a stranger." "Maybe I don't think of you as a stranger," I said, and I remember my heart pounding so hard when I said it that I was sure she could hear it. She did not say anything to that. She just smiled again, that same smile from Friday evening, and she asked me if I would like to come to the meeting on Monday and see what all this trouble had been for. I went, of course. I stood at the back of a crowded room above a hardware store on Halsted Street, watching Dorothy Callahan stand up in front of nearly 200 people, all of them furious about their neighborhood, and I watched her calm them down and organize them and give them, one by one, small jobs to do. Call this office. Write this letter. Show up at this hearing. She was magnificent. I had never in my life met a woman like her. The girls I had known before her were sweet and kind and mostly interested in getting married and having a house with a nice yard someday. Dorothy Callahan wanted to save a building full of strangers from a wrecking ball, and she wanted nothing in return except to see it done. That was the beginning. That was the moment my whole life changed direction, though I did not know it yet. After the meeting, a group of us walked down to a diner on Halsted called the Golden Nugget, a place that is long gone now, torn down sometime in the 80s for a strip mall. But back then, it was the kind of place where you could get a cup of coffee for 15 cents and sit in a booth until midnight and nobody would bother you. Dorothy sat across from me in that booth, still flushed from the excitement of the meeting, and she told me about her family. Her father had been a longshoreman who came from Ireland as a boy, and her mother had died when Dorothy was 16, leaving her to help raise 2 younger brothers while her father worked long hours at the docks. She told me she had wanted to go to college too, like me, but there had been no money for it after her mother passed, and so she had taught herself by reading every book she could get her hands on from the public library, and by watching the men who ran the neighborhood associations and learning, piece by piece, how power actually moved through a city. "I'm going to run for alderman myself one day," she told me that night, stirring sugar into her coffee. "Not this year, not next year, but one day. People in this neighborhood deserve somebody who actually grew up here fighting for them." I believed her completely. I want you to understand that about Dorothy Callahan. She was not a woman who said things she did not mean. Everything that came out of her mouth had weight to it, had intention behind it. I had known plenty of people in my life who talked about dreams the way you talk about the weather, just something to fill the silence. Dorothy talked about her dreams like they were already halfway built. We started seeing each other after that, though it did not feel like dating in the way my parents would have understood the word. There was no formal asking her out, no corsage, no meeting her father across a dinner table with him giving me a hard look. It started with her showing up at the print shop on Wednesday evenings, when I got off work at 9, and we would walk along Wabash under the L tracks, sometimes all the way down to the lake, just talking. She talked about the neighborhood, about the settlement house, about a family on her street whose landlord was trying to push them out to raise the rent. I talked about buildings, about the drawings in my sketchbook, about the kind of architect I wanted to be someday, one who built things for regular people instead of only for banks and rich men downtown. I remember one night in July, we sat on a bench near Buckingham Fountain, and the water was lit up in all those colors they used back then, red and blue and green cycling through the spray, and Dorothy leaned her head against my shoulder without saying a word. We just sat there for almost an hour, watching the water and the lights and the couples walking past. And I remember thinking that I had never in my life felt so calm and so alive at the exact same time. There is a particular kind of quiet that only exists between two people who have stopped needing to perform for each other. That is the quiet we had that night. I kissed her for the first time 3 weeks after we met, outside the door of the boarding house where she rented a room on Racine Avenue. It had started to rain, one of those sudden Chicago summer rains that comes out of nowhere and soaks you before you can find shelter. And we had run the last 2 blocks laughing like children. And when we got to her door, both of us soaked through, hair plastered down, she looked up at me and I just knew. I do not know how else to explain it. I leaned down and I kissed her, and she kissed me back, and the rain kept falling around us. And somewhere down the block, somebody had their radio on, playing "You Are the Sunshine of My Life" through an open window. And I remember thinking, this is it. This is the woman I am going to marry. That summer became the best months of my entire life up to that point. We went to Riverview before they tore it down, that old amusement park on the north side, and Dorothy screamed the whole way down the Bobs, that big wooden roller coaster, and afterwards she made me buy her a candy apple, even though she said the ride had made her feel sick because she said the candy apple would fix it. We went to see American Graffiti at a movie theater on State Street, and afterward we walked for 2 hours talking about how strange it was that a movie about 1962 already felt like it was about a different world, even though only 11 years had passed. We danced at a wedding for one of her cousins in a union hall in Pilsen, and I remember her father, a stocky, quiet man named Michael Callahan, watching us dance from across the room with an expression on his face I could not quite read, something between approval and worry, like he already suspected that his daughter loved too hard and too completely for her own good. I told her I loved her in August on the roof of her boarding house, where the tenants were allowed to go up and sit on lawn chairs in the evening to catch whatever breeze came off the lake. The sky over Chicago that night was the color of a bruise turning purple and orange at the edges, the sun going down behind the buildings, and Dorothy had her bare feet propped up on the low brick wall of the roof, and I just said it. I did not plan it. It came out of me the way water comes out of a broken pipe, all at once and impossible to stop. "I love you, Dorothy Callahan," I said. She turned her head and looked at me for a long moment, and I remember my whole body going tight, waiting, terrified that I had said too much too soon. And then she smiled, that same smile from the print shop that very first evening, and she said, "I was wondering how long it would take you to say it. I've loved you since the day you redesigned my flyers, Walter Hastings. You didn't have to make them beautiful. You just wanted to. I have carried those words with me for 50 years. I have carried them the way some men carry a photograph in their wallet, worn soft at the edges from being touched too many times. I thought, that August, that I had found the rest of my life. I thought Dorothy Callahan and I were going to grow old together in Chicago, that I would become an architect and she would become an alderman, and we would raise children who grew up believing that a person could actually change the place they came from if they cared enough and worked hard enough. I was 21 years old, and I believed, with my whole young heart, that love like ours did not break. I was wrong, and the way I found out I was wrong is a part of this story I still find difficult to tell, even now, even 50 years later, sitting on my porch with my coffee gone cold. In September of that year, Dorothy's work with the settlement house brought a man into her life named Gerald Whitfield. He was a lawyer a few years older than us who volunteered his time helping the neighborhood association with the legal side of the fight to save the building on Halsted. He came from money, real money, a family with a house up in Lake Forest and a law degree from Northwestern, and I remember the first time Dorothy introduced us at a strategy meeting in the back room of a church. I felt something in my stomach go cold and tight, though I could not have told you why at the time. He had a way of talking to Dorothy that was different from the way he talked to anyone else in the room, a kind of leaning in attention. And Dorothy, being Dorothy, was too focused on the fight to save that building to notice. Or maybe she noticed and simply did not think anything of it, because she trusted people the way she trusted her own convictions, completely and without reservation. Over the following weeks, Gerald became a fixture. He drove Dorothy to City Hall for hearings in his car, a Buick Riviera that I remember specifically because it was the kind of car nobody in our neighborhood could afford. He took her to lunch to discuss legal strategy. He called her boarding house in the evenings, and the landlady would come knocking on doors to fetch her to the hallway telephone. I told myself over and over that this was simply the work. I told myself that a woman like Dorothy Callahan, a woman with that much fire and purpose, needed a wide net of allies, and Gerald was simply one of them. I told myself a lot of things that fall, Walter, because the alternative was too frightening to look at directly. By October, the settlement house had been saved. The alderman's office reversed its decision after enough public pressure, and there was a celebration at the church, cider and donuts, and Dorothy standing on a chair to make a small speech, her cheeks flushed with the kind of joy that only comes from fighting for something and winning. I was so proud of her that night, I thought my chest would split open. I remember thinking, watching her up on that chair, that I had never loved another human being the way I loved her in that moment. It was 2 weeks after that celebration that I came to her boarding house on a Wednesday evening, the way I always did, and the landlady told me Dorothy was not in, that she had gone out for dinner. I did not think much of it. I walked down toward Halsted, toward a little Italian place we sometimes went, thinking I might find her there and surprise her. And I did find her there. She was sitting in a booth by the window, and across from her sat Gerald Whitfield, and his hand was resting on top of hers on the table, and she was not pulling it away. I stood outside that restaurant window for what felt like an hour, but was probably only 30 seconds. I watched Dorothy Callahan, the woman I loved more than my own life, laugh at something Gerald said, and I watched him lean across the table and kiss her, quick and soft, the way people kiss when it is not the first time they have done it. I do not remember walking away from that window. I do not remember the walk back to my apartment. I remember waking up the next morning still in my clothes from the night before, and I remember feeling like someone had reached into my chest and removed something vital, something I would spend the rest of my life trying to grow back. I confronted her 3 days later. I want to tell you I handled it with grace, but I did not. I was 21 years old and my heart was broken in a way I did not have the tools to survive gracefully. I went to her boarding house and I told her what I had seen, and I watched her face go through something complicated, guilt and defensiveness, and something that might have been relief, like a weight had finally been set down. "It's not what you think, Walter," she said, but her voice did not have the steel in it that I had fallen in love with. It had something smaller in it. "Then tell me what it is," I said. She was quiet for a long time, and then she told me the truth, and I will give her this, even now, 50 years later, sitting on my porch. She did not lie to me when I finally forced the question. She told me that Gerald had asked her to marry him, that his family had money and connections that could get her onto the city council in half the time. It would take her on her own, working the way she had been working, one flyer and one meeting at a time. She told me that she still loved me, that loving me was not the question, that she had never once stopped loving me. But she said something else that night that I have turned over in my mind 10,000 times since. She said, "Walter, I watched my mother work herself into an early grave with nothing to show for it but love for a man who could never give her anything more than love. I don't want love to be the only thing I have when I'm 40. I told her that was a cruel thing to say to a man who had nothing to offer her but love. She told me she knew it was cruel, and she was sorry, and she was going to marry Gerald Whitfield anyway. I walked out of that boarding house and I did not look back. And I did not speak to Dorothy Callahan again for 50 years. I want to tell you what the next 50 years of my life look like. Because a story like this one is not just about the years you spend with someone. It is about all the years you spend after and what you build out of the wreckage. I finished my degree in architecture in 1976, working nights the whole way through. For a long time after Dorothy, I did not date anyone seriously. My mother worried about me. She would ask over Sunday dinner why a good-looking young man with a steady job was not bringing girls around anymore. And I would tell her I was focused on my career, which was true, but it was also a shield I held up in front of a wound that had not healed. I threw myself into my work. I got a position at a small firm downtown, and I spent my 20s learning the craft, drawing buildings, walking construction sites in a hard hat, slowly becoming the architect I had always told Dorothy I wanted to be. I met my wife Margaret in 1979 at a friend's engagement party. Margaret was a school teacher, gentle and patient in a way I had never experienced from a woman before, and steady, so steady in a way that I think my heart needed after everything. I will tell you plainly because I believe in telling the truth in a story like this one. I did not fall in love with Margaret the way I fell in love with Dorothy. It was not lightning. It was not a summer that changed the shape of my whole life in 11 months. It was slower, quieter, something that grew instead of something that struck. But I want you to understand that slow, quiet love is not lesser love. I loved Margaret Hastings for 41 years until the cancer took her in 2019, and I do not regret a single day of that marriage. She gave me 2 children, a son named David who became a doctor, and a daughter named Susan who became, of all things, a city planner, which still makes me smile when I think about it, given everything. Margaret knew about Dorothy. I told her early on, honestly, that there had been a woman before her who I had loved with a kind of desperate, burning love, and that it had ended badly, and that some small corner of my heart still ached over it sometimes. Late at night, for no reason I could explain, Margaret took my hand when I told her that, and she said something I have never forgotten. She said, "Walter, I don't need to be the only love of your life. I just need to be the love of the rest of it." That is the kind of woman Margaret was, and I loved her for it every single day we had together. I built a career I was proud of. I designed 3 schools on the north side, a library in Evanston that still stands, and a community center in Bridgeport, not far from where I grew up, that I designed with wide windows and open, welcoming rooms, because I never forgot what Dorothy taught me that first summer, that buildings should be built for the people who actually live in a neighborhood, not just for the people with money. I thought about her sometimes when I walked through that community center. I would stand in the main hall and imagine her standing on a chair in there, the way she had stood on that chair at the church making a speech, her cheeks flushed with victory. I heard about her over the years in fragments, the way you hear about people from a former life. A mutual friend told me, sometime around 1980, that she had married Gerald Whitfield and that they had moved to Lake Forest. Another friend mentioned, years later, at a funeral for someone from our old neighborhood, that Dorothy had indeed run for office, alderman of a ward on the north side, and had won, and had served for over a decade before eventually moving into some kind of nonprofit work related to housing. I heard secondhand that she and Gerald had 2 children. I heard secondhand sometime in the early 2000s that they had divorced. I did not reach out. I want to be honest, there were nights, especially after Margaret passed, when I sat in this very house with a glass of whiskey and thought about finding a phone number for Dorothy Callahan and calling her, just to hear her voice, just to ask her if she still thought about that summer the way I did. I never made the call. Pride is a strange, stubborn thing in an old man's chest, and I think some part of me was still that 21-year-old boy standing outside a restaurant window, watching the woman he loved kiss someone else. And that part of me could not quite forgive her, even 50 years later, even though I understood by then, with the wisdom that only age gives you, exactly why she had done what she did. Margaret passed away in the spring of 2019. It was ovarian cancer, and it moved fast, faster than the doctors expected. And within 8 months of her diagnosis, I was standing at her graveside in a cemetery in Evanston, holding my daughter's hand while my son gave the eulogy, feeling like the ground itself had opened up beneath me. Grief when you are 70 years old and you have loved someone for 41 years is not like the grief of a young man. It does not come in violent waves. It settles into your bones like winter settles into old brick, slow and permanent and cold in a way that never quite leaves. For the next 2 years, I lived alone in this house, and my children worried about me the way I imagine I once worried my own mother. David called every Sunday. Susan drove up from the city most weekends with groceries I did not really need, just to check on me, just to sit with me for an hour. I told them I was fine. I was not lying exactly. I was surviving. There is a difference between the two, and I think most people who have lost a spouse of many decades understand that difference in their bones. And then, in the spring of 2023, something happened that I could not have predicted if I had spent the rest of my life trying. My daughter Susan, in her work as a city planner, had been assigned to a project involving the redevelopment of several community centers on the north side, one of which turned out to be the very building I had designed back in the 1980s in Bridgeport. The city was putting together a panel of longtime community advocates and original stakeholders to advise on renovations, honoring people who had shaped the neighborhood over the decades. Susan, without telling me the full guest list, asked me to come to the first planning meeting since I had designed the building and might have useful thoughts on preserving its character. I almost did not go. My knees had been bothering me that week, and it was a cold, wet April day, the kind of Chicago spring that cannot decide if it wants to be winter or not. But Susan asked twice, and I did not want to disappoint her, so I put on my good coat and drove myself down to Bridgeport, to the community center I had designed 40 years earlier. And I walked into that wide-windowed main hall I remembered so well, and there, sitting at a folding table with a name placard in front of her, was Dorothy Callahan. She looked up when I walked in, and I watched her face go through the exact sequence of emotions I imagine mine went through. Shock first, then something like disbelief, her eyes searching my face for the boy she remembered underneath 72 years of living. And then, unmistakably, joy, real joy, the kind that cannot be faked or performed, breaking across her features like sunrise. Her hair was white now, cut short and practical, and there were lines around her eyes that had not been there in 1973. But her eyes themselves had not changed one bit. They still held that same fire, banked down now with age but not extinguished. Her name placard read Dorothy Callahan, not Whitfield. I noticed that immediately. Walter, she said, standing up so fast her chair nearly tipped over. Walter Hastings. Dorothy, I said, and my voice came out rougher than I intended. 50 years of unspoken things caught in my throat all at once. We did not embrace. Not that first moment, not in a room full of city officials and note-taking assistants. We simply stood there, 10 feet apart, looking at each other across 5 decades. And I remember thinking that time is a strange and merciless thing. The way it can make a person into someone entirely new while leaving, somewhere underneath all the years, the exact same person you once knew standing right there in their eyes. We found each other after the meeting, out in the small parking lot, both of us lingering longer than we needed to, both of us clearly hoping the other would not simply drive away. Dorothy told me she had moved back to the city a few years earlier, after her divorce from Gerald finalized in 2004, settling into a condo not far from where we used to walk along Wabash. She told me she had indeed served as alderman for 14 years, had fought for affordable housing her entire career, had 2 grown children and 4 grandchildren she adored. She told me, standing there in that cold April parking lot, with her coat pulled tight against the wind, that she had heard about Margaret's passing through a mutual acquaintance, and that she had thought about writing to me, and had not, because she was not sure I would want to hear from her after everything. I thought about calling you too, I admitted, more times than I probably should tell you. Why didn't you? She asked. I thought about that question for a long moment before I answered it honestly, because I was afraid that if I heard your voice again, I would have to feel all of it again. The whole thing. Not just missing you. The anger too. I didn't know if I had it in me anymore, at 70 years old, to feel something that big. Dorothy looked at me with an expression I recognized from 50 years earlier, that same steady, searching look she had given me over flyers on a counter in a print shop. Walter, she said, I have spent 50 years being sorry for what I did to you. I made a choice out of fear, not out of love, and I have never once in 50 years stopped regretting it. Gerald gave me a life of comfort, and I used that comfort to do good work, real work, work I'm proud of. But he never once made me feel the way you made me feel in that one summer. Not in 31 years of marriage. I want you to know that, even if it changes nothing between us now. I did not say anything for a long time. The wind was cutting through that parking lot, and somewhere in the distance an L train rattled past. The same sound I remembered from 50 years earlier, and I felt something in my chest loosen. Some knot I had been carrying since 1973, without even realizing how tightly it had been tied. It changes something, I finally said. It changes the fact that I've been angry at a version of you that maybe never fully existed. A villain. It's easier to be angry at a villain than to understand a scared 22-year-old girl trying to build a life for herself with the only tools she thought she had. We began after that day to see each other. Slowly at first, the way you approach something you are not sure will hold your weight. Coffee the first week, at a small shop not far from her condo. A walk along the lakefront the second week, retracing, without either of us saying so out loud, some of the same paths we had walked as young people, though the shoreline itself had changed so much over 50 years that it barely resembled what we remembered. We talked about everything. We talked about Margaret and Gerald, about our children and grandchildren, about the buildings I had designed and the policies she had fought for, about growing old and what it teaches you that youth cannot. I asked her to dinner properly in June, a real date, the kind neither of us had been on in longer than either of us cared to admit. I picked her up at her condo in my car, which embarrassed my son David terribly when I told him about it. An old man in his 70s picking up a date like it was 1973 all over again. But I did not care. I wore a good jacket. I brought her flowers, yellow ones, because I remembered the sundress she had worn the first day I met her. And something in me wanted to honor that girl even as I fell in love with the woman she had become. We were married the following spring, in April of 2024, in a small ceremony in the very community center I had designed, the wide windows letting in the same kind of golden late afternoon light that had lit up Dorothy's face 51 years earlier in a print shop on Wabash Avenue. My son David walked me down what passed for an aisle, since my own father had long since passed. Dorothy's daughter gave her away. Susan cried through the entire ceremony and later told me it was because she had never in her life seen her father look the way I looked that day, like a man who had finally set down something heavy he had been carrying for half a century. Dorothy and I have been married a little over 2 years now. We are old, both of us, in the way that old age actually feels from the inside, which is different from how it looks from the outside. My knees ache. Her hip gives her trouble in cold weather. We take more naps than either of us would like to admit, and we go to more doctor's appointments than we go to dinner parties these days. But I want you to understand something if you have listened this far into an old man's story. I have never, not once, in 2 years of marriage to Dorothy Callahan, woken up and wondered if I made the right choice. I spent 50 years believing that my great love story had already happened and already ended, that the rest of my life was simply the long, quiet business of living with what was left over. I was wrong about that too, just as I was wrong at 21 to believe that love like ours could not break. Here is what I have learned in 72 years of living, in 1 summer of first love, and 50 years of everything that came after it. Love does not follow a schedule. It does not arrive once and never again. It does not care whether you are 21 years old on a rooftop in Chicago or 71 years old in a parking lot outside a community center you designed 4 decades earlier. Love comes when it comes, on its own time, sometimes when you have stopped looking for it entirely, sometimes when you believe, with your whole worn-out heart, that your chance for it has already passed you by. I thought my story with Dorothy Callahan ended in the autumn of 1973, outside a restaurant window on Halsted Street. I was wrong. It was only the first chapter. The best chapter, the one I am living now, was waiting for me 50 years down the road. And I would never have believed it if you had told me so back when I was young, and my heart was broken, and I thought I understood everything there was to know about love and loss. If there is one thing I want you to take from my story tonight, it is this. Do not let a broken heart convince you that your capacity for love is finished. Do not let 50 years or 20 years or even 5 years of loneliness convince you that your chapter has already been written. My name is Walter Robert Hastings, and I am 72 years old, and I am more in love today than I have been since I was 21 years old on a rooftop in Chicago, telling a girl in a yellow sundress that I loved her for the very first time. Some stories take 50 years to find their proper ending. Mine did, and I am grateful. Every single morning I wake up beside Dorothy Callahan that I lived long enough to see how mine turned out.